Legal threats to journalists are increasingly used to restrict free media. The most common such threat is the so-called SLAPP, or strategic lawsuit against public participation. Large institutions and organizations use SLAPPs to silence journalists, publishers, and activists who work on topics that are inconvenient for the authorities, political parties, huge companies, or other influential people. What's important in this kind of lawsuit is that there is no balance between the parties, particularly in terms of financial capabilities and influence. The authorities often use their entire apparatus and file numerous lawsuits against a specific journalist or editorial office. Another problem with SLAPPs is that there is no maximum compensation the prosecution can pursue.
Quando ti arriva la notizia che hai ricevuto una causa civile per migliaia di euro, come mi è successo di recente per milioni di euro, pensi a alcune cose. La prima, quella delle cause civili rappresenta la vera mordacchia insieme alle intimidazioni dei clan. E poi resti tu, il silenzio e anche spesso, troppe volte.
I wrote a book and made a documentary about a village fighting against pesticides. Both of them generated a lot of attention. The government in South Tyrol dragged me into court because of this. At first I didn't know how to cope with the high costs.
The aim of the lawsuit is not only to win, but also to intimidate, harass, discredit, and drain the journalist, both physically and financially, so that other people don't want to report on similar topics. So there's a reason why SLAPP sounds like a slap in the face.
Una querela temeraria è una spada di Damocle sulla testa. La prima l'ho ricevuta 22 anni fa, ancora ci combatto, era il 31 dicembre del 98, c'era ancora la lira, semplicemente per aver fatto il mio mestiere.
The term SLAPP was coined in the US in the 1980s, but in Europe it became known only a few years ago when Maltese journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia was murdered. On her blog, she exposed the darkest aspects of Maltese public life and described, among other things, cases of corruption involving politicians. She was killed by a car bomb in 2017. Before that, there had been attempts to intimidate her. At the time of her death, there were 43 lawsuits in place against her. Maltese politicians and businessmen had accused her of defamation. From that moment, non-governmental organizations have documented cases of using lawsuits, such as SLAPPs, against journalists in Europe.
We use the Mapping Media Freedom platform to register and document SLAPPs, an excellent platform that provides you an overview of all threats used against journalists and media outlets.
On the Mapping Media Freedom website, there are over 6,000 alerts regarding various violations of journalists' rights.
To give you an example of SLAPPs, in Slovenia there is a media outlet called Necenzurirano. Each of their 3 journalists is facing 13 defamation lawsuits, in total 39 defamation lawsuits, which are filed by a non-official advisor of the current Prime Minister of Slovenia. These lawsuits contain all the characteristics of SLAPPs, and if they are successful, journalists will face up to 1 year in prison, or they'll have to pay a fine.
Yet another example of an attempt to restrict media reports is what happened recently to the journalists reporting on events at the Poland-Belarus border. In that area, Polish authorities introduced a state of emergency, which made it practically impossible for the media to work there. As a result, citizens were cut off from independent information about what was going on. Despite the prohibition, ONET journalists went close to the border to carry out their professional mission and do their job.
Nikt nie zainteresował się naszą obecnością, dlatego postanowiliśmy wyciągnąć kamerę, opowiedzieć nasze przemyślenia, jak to wszystko wyglądało, na czym stan wyjątkowy polega. Zostały nam postawione zarzuty, nawet jeden wyrok już zapadł, to jest 1000 zł od osoby plus zwrot kosztów sądowych, ale to postępowanie cały czas się toczy, no i wszyscy czekamy na jego finał.
The purpose of SLAPPs is to restrict the freedom of media and influence their work. Individual journalists are too weak to fight big companies and influential people alone. They need the support of a powerful institution, and that kind of support has already been announced.
We will be considering some aid, some legal aid, or some funding for the journalists who suffer from such abuse.